Well, good morning. I'm Greg McQuade from WTVR CBS 6 in Richmond, Virginia, and it is my distinct pleasure and honor to serve as Master of Ceremonies for this most memorable event. On behalf of the Virginia World War I and World War II Commemoration Commission, welcome to this special commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Today, we are streaming live from the deck of the USS Wisconsin in Norfolk, a sister ship of the same class of the USS Missouri, on which the surrender documents that ended World War II 75 years ago today in Tokyo Bay. Nearly 4 years ago, 80 World War II veterans gathered in Richmond to be honored on the 75th anniversary and the entry of America into the war. Today, as we mark the war's end, we have no live audience and cannot pay tribute to our veterans in person, but we honor and thank each and every one watching from home. And of course, we honor and remember those who are no longer with us. We are pleased to be joined virtually this morning by veterans at locations across Virginia, including World War II veterans at the Sitter and Barfoot Veterans Care Center in Richmond, where we are simulcasting live. They are watching today. We welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. I would ask you now to join us for the Pledge of Allegiance led by the Virginia Department of Veterans Services Commissioner, Mr. John Maxwell.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
World War II ended officially on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, at a ceremony presided over by General Douglas MacArthur on the surrender deck of the USS Missouri. To mark this moment on the surrender deck of the USS Wisconsin, we are joined by Major General Timothy Williams, the Adjutant General of Virginia, reading General MacArthur's speech from that morning. And in front of General Williams, on loan from the MacArthur Memorial here in Norfolk, is one of the original pens used to sign the instrument of surrender back in 1945.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involved, divergent ideals and ideologies, have been determined on the battlefields of the war, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. Nor is it for us here to meet representing, as we do, a majority of the peoples of the earth, in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred, but rather it is for us, both victors and vanquished, to rise to that higher dignity which alone befits the sacred purposes we are about to serve, committing all of our peoples unreservedly to faithful compliance with the undertakings they are here formally to assume. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it is my firm purpose in the tradition of the countries I represent to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with. I now invite representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
The instrument of surrender was signed by the representatives of Japan, followed by General MacArthur and the representatives of the Allied powers. The document identifies as 9:08 as the official time of signing and the moment that World War II came to an end at that moment 75 years ago. Please join us in a moment of silence to remember that moment and to honor all of those who gave their lives to create a better world. Musician First Class Kevin Creasy. In a few moments, we will have a flyover. Overhead will be two U.S. Navy FA-18F Super Hornets, honoring those whose sacrifices won the war 75 years ago. The lead aircraft will be piloted by Commander Harrison, the wing aircraft piloted by Lieutenant Flanagan. The two Super Hornets are from Strike Fighter Squadron 213, the world-famous Fighting Black Lions stationed aboard Naval Air Station Oceana.
Let us pray that peace now be restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are now closed.
It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Christopher Kolakowski, Director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum and former Director of the MacArthur Memorial here in Norfolk. He joins us remotely from Wisconsin for this morning's keynote address.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody in Norfolk, across Virginia, and around the world. It is an honor and a privilege to speak to you this morning on this very important occasion. On August 3rd, 1944, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff offered thoughts to the Secretary of State on the post-war world, the world after World War II. The successful termination of the war against our present enemies, they said, will find a world profoundly changed, a change more comparable indeed with that occasioned by the fall of Rome than with any other change occurring within the succeeding 1,500 years. In other words, of the last two millennia, World War II ranks as one of the most important events ever. General MacArthur today, 75 years ago today, echoed the importance of this moment when he wished that a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. It's impossible to overstate the immensity and importance of the events we commemorate today and we have commemorated for the past 6 years. World War II started on September 1, 1939, 81 years ago yesterday, and formally ended 75 years ago today. Over that 6 years and 1 day, the conflict swept around the world, merging with the Second Sino-Japanese War and other conflicts. At the end, 56 million people had perished as a direct cause of the war, 24 million service members and 32 million civilians, including at least 11 million in the Holocaust. 3 out of every 8 of those deaths, over 21 million, were from the Soviet Union, while 2 of every 8, nearly 14 million, were from China. These numbers I've just quoted to you do not include the many millions who died of the war's indirect effects or the wounded, both of which, if you include them, push the numbers higher, by some estimates over 100 million total casualties for the war. World War II was a demographic earthquake of the first order, with effects still apparent in many countries today. The United States formally entered the war on December 7th, 1941, although I should point out Americans had been fighting beforehand in other nations' armed forces. From 1941 to 1945, 16 million Americans served all over the world. Americans were on all 4 oceans and 6 continents, in all places, all weathers. Many places saw American troops for the first time, or the first time in a long time. United States equipment also kept many allies in the war through the Lend-Lease program. There was nothing like it before or since in American history. United States forces, with their many allies around the world, accomplished the longest invasion in history with Operation Torch from Norfolk and Hampton Roads to North Africa in 1942. The largest invasion in history was Normandy in June 1944. They became the first troops to capture Rome from the south in 1500 years. They hacked the Lido Road out of impenetrable Burmese jungle. They swept the Pacific of Japanese ships. They fought some of the country's largest and most sanguinary battles on land, sea, and air, and projected American power in places it had gone seldom, if ever, and ushered in a new age of warfare. In the process, they smashed the tyrannical ambitions of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, and their fellow travelers. Millions of people owed their freedom to Allied victory in 1945. For much of the world, 1945 is yesterday. Indeed, much of the world we see today has its roots in World War II and its immediate aftermath. The war made the United States and the Soviet Union the 2 great superpowers, while colonial powers like Britain, France, and the Netherlands stood diminished and could not hold on to their empires as their colonies sought independence. It is no accident that many of the major international organizations created after World War II, like the United Nations or the World Bank, were set up in the United States and are headquartered in New York and Washington. The effects of these general trends are visible around the globe. Let's start where the war started, in Europe. The borders of Europe started moving with the fourth partition of Poland in September 1939. When they stopped, the modern map of Europe was what resulted. These border changes also resulted in the death or displacement of millions, changing the very makeup of Europe's population. The Iron Curtain came down in the wake of the war, dividing the continent into communist East versus democratic West for 45 years. And in many ways, Europe didn't truly achieve peace until 1989. The Balkans, 1999. World War II continues to echo in Europe's politics today. Without understanding Operation Barbarossa in 1941, what it did to the Soviet Union, and the Russian desire to never see anything like that again, the Cold War and modern Russian policy toward NATO's expansion just don't make sense. Also, why does the Kaliningrad enclave exist? Well, the answer is that the Soviet Union, Stalin, wanted a Baltic warm water port, and in 1945 took the northern half of the former East Prussia to get it. That decision resonates in European geopolitics today. Moving to the east, south, and southeast, the post-war partition of Palestine created conflicts that remain with us today. The retreat of colonial empires redrew the maps of Africa and the Middle East, sparking new conflicts over the succeeding decades. This brings us in our survey as we go eastward to Asia, where World War II left the United States the dominant power in the region, but also carried the seeds of future conflicts. The partition of India, which was sparked in part by trials of pro-Japanese Indians, resulted in upheavals and 4 wars between India and Pakistan since 1947. Burma, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines all received independence in the years after 1945, each led by people who rose to prominence during the war. Korea was divided in 1945, a division that was supposed to be temporary, but lasts to today and has sparked at least one major war. Indonesia and Indochina fought successful wars of independence, the latter lasting 3 decades. In fact, the US involvement in Southeast Asia, which is a term itself that comes from World War II, it started in March of 1942 with the arrival of General Joseph Stilwell in Burma and ended only with the fall of Saigon in 1975. Territorial disputes like the South China Sea and the Kuril Islands started in 1945 and are still flashpoints today. The memory of World War II is contentious in places, especially between Poland and Russia, many countries in Germany, and China and Korea and Japan. On the other, more positive hand, the fact that the United States kept its promise to liberate the Philippines makes the country a trusted partner in Asia. The People's Republic of China has been building museums to the Flying Tigers, to General Stilwell, and to the Hump Airlift over the Himalayas as a way to reconnect relationships between the China and the United States that had been cut in 1949. The war didn't just define the modern world. Service in World War II defined lives. Many of the war's participants drew great benefits from service and the sense of doing one's duty to something larger than themselves. The memories of service lingered for years, sometimes, especially for former prisoners of war, families of the dead, or those seriously wounded, with unhappy effects. These experiences collectively marked a generation, and in some ways have extended to the generations since. I'd like to point out just a few examples this morning. The first one I'll point out is Farmville, Virginia's own Sam Wilson, Samuel V. Wilson, who as a 21-year-old volunteered for Merrill's Marauders as a lieutenant. And on a hilltop in Burma in the spring of 1944, through an atmospheric quirk, was able to pick up on the radio Russian news broadcasts. He became fascinated by the Russians and what they were going through and the fortitude of a nation to endure an onslaught like what the Germans had done with the invasion of the Soviet Union from 1941, obviously, in the years since. And at that moment, he decided, if I get out of the war, I want to study these people because they are going to be important in the post-war world, and I want to know them, and I want to know how they tick, and I want to be a part of that and help Americans understand that and appreciate it as I do. That decision, that experience on that hilltop in Burma during the war changed his life because after the war, he did exactly that. Later ran the Defense Intelligence Agency, for a long time was known as one of the important Russian experts in the US military. And even after he retired as a lieutenant general in the 1970s, still remains an expert on Soviet affairs and a sought after expert. Many people probably know him also as General Sam because for a long time he was the president of Hampton-Sydney College just south of Farmville. But again, without that experience, that atmospheric quirk on the hilltop in Burma, his life after the war may have been very different. His life in general may have been very different. Another example that I will give you is John Kennedy, who commanded a PT boat, famously commanded a PT boat and survived a shipwreck in the South Pacific. And his war record in the US Navy certainly helped catapult him into political prominence in the years after the war. The spirit of 1941 to 45 and the spirit of that generation showed through in his inaugural address in 1961, when he asked the question, where he made the statement, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." That's the spirit that motivated his generation during the World War II years and continued to motivate them into the 1960s and beyond. I also would point out as well, if you look at his decision-making and his response to the Berlin crisis in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, you have to wonder how much of that was a direct response to what he had witnessed in World War II. And I should point out that his counterpart during both crises, Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, was a World War II vet himself. and had served at the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the war's largest and bloodiest and most terrible battles, had served at Kursk and the liberation of Kiev. So both of these men understood, having lived through World War II, had understood what World War meant, and were not anxious if they needed to, or were not anxious to try and trigger the Third World War if possible, and certainly understood the potential impacts viscerally through experience, the visceral potential impacts of their decisions at those times. Another person that I will mention that was marked by the war is my own grandfather, Bolesław Kolakowski, or Bolesław Kolakowski, as they say it in Poland. My grandfather was born in the United States, and when independent Poland reappeared on the map after World War I, the family went back and settled in our old town 50 miles north of Warsaw. He was raised Polish and was in the Polish Army in 1939 when the war started. When the Soviets invaded in mid-September, his unit evacuated to Lithuania and accepted internment. After September 1st, 1939, he never saw his parents again. And after September 19th, 1939, when he left Poland, he never went back to Polish soil again. A year later, he was interned by the Lithuanians when the Soviets invade, ends up in the Gulag. The experience of 2.5 years in Soviet captivity nearly killed him. Also turned him from a good Catholic boy into an atheist. He told my father once later, he says, "After what I have seen during the war, there is no God." He was able to evacuate through Iran via the Anders Army, which later becomes famous as the Polish Second Corps and the liberators of the Abbey of Monte Cassino in May of 1944. He ends up in the United Kingdom and working for the Free Polish Forces there, where he meets my grandmother during a V2 strike in 1944. My grandmother, being English, has her own war history, being a telephone operator in the British Admiralty all during that period. At the end of the war, he's given a choice whether to go back to Poland, which has now fallen under communist domination, or to go somewhere else. And he's had enough of the communists. In fact, some of his friends that decide to go back end up disappearing, and decides that that's not going to be the case. And his wife points out, do you realize where you were born? And he hadn't attached any importance to it. And she says, that makes you a US citizen. And so in 1947, they come to the United States and settle in New York, and later Virginia, and ultimately Florida. My grandfather wanted to put the war behind him, but he lived with the war every single day of his life until his death in 1982. The memories haunted him. He never saw his parents again. He never saw Poland again. And my father and I both grew up with the idea that, first of all, part of us was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, but also the fact was that the defining event in our family's history over the last 100 years was the Second World War. It's not too much to say that if the German army had not crossed the Polish frontier on September 1, 1939, I would be giving you this address in Polish, because our family would not have come to the United States. And so I use my grandfather to illustrate the tremendous impact of the war on that family, but also use him as an exemplar, because he is not alone. There are millions of Poles, and there are millions of other people of other nationalities as well that ended up dispersed and displaced around the world from the places they grew up, their ancestral homelands, because of the Second World War and its immediate after effects. And that must never be forgotten, the demographic impact of the war, of which I use my grandfather here as an exemplar. I'd also like to point out that civil rights icons, Medgar Evers, Jackie Robinson, World War II veterans, Claire Booth Luce, Martha Gellhorn, Margaret Burke White, they helped bring the war home through their reporting. And for those who remember the Smothers Brothers, their anti-war politics were influenced and probably created by the fact that their father, who was a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel captured on Bataan in April 1942, died as a prisoner of war when they were very young. Internationally, the positions and policies of leaders like Britain's Queen Elizabeth II, Burma's Aung San Suu Kyi, or even Russia's Vladimir Putin can only be understood by considering the stories of them and their families in World War II. This is not ancient history by any means. The war and its effects also changed the United States. Notable social advances that were impacted by the war include, first, integration of the armed forces in 1948, shortly after the war. African American troops, Black troops had served in segregated units, both in combat units, non combat units, on the air and in the ground and on the seas, all through the war. And they had proven themselves again and again, both in combat and those combat and non combat roles. And in recognition of that equal status, which was deserved, the military was desegregated in 1948, a tremendous step forward for equal rights in this country. The same can be said for women's rights. 1943, 42, 43, the creation of the Women's Army Corps in the Army, the creation of the Waves in the Navy, women on the home front, Rosie the Riveter, tremendous steps forward for women's rights and women's place as active citizens in the United States, and a path that has continued forward over the decades since the war, but certainly was energized by the war years, 1941 to 1945. The GI Bill and new veterans benefits created toward the end of the war rewrote the nation's commitment to veterans, educated a generation, and ensured general post-war economic growth and security for the United States. Also, the interstate highway system has its roots in World War II also. General Dwight Eisenhower had seen the Autobahns in Germany, and they inspired him to create something similar here. In fact, I'd like to point out as well, Eisenhower was only the first of our World War II veteran presidents. World War II veterans served as US president from 1953 to 1993, a critical 40-year span in US history. Other World War II veterans became governors, legislators, mayors, or community and business leaders, with influence extending into this century. When you look at the changes they wrought during the war and in the decades after, there can be no question that the World War II generation has left a lasting and consequential mark on the nation and the world. I conclude my remarks by returning to the prediction of 1944, a world profoundly changed. That statement was absolutely correct on a personal, national, and international level. Indeed, to see the World War II generation's true monument, just look at the world today. We are in a better place than September 1939, and we must work to keep it that way. On a battlefield of World War II, in the eastern India town of Kohima, is a monument with a very powerful inscription. It reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." This is that tomorrow. And this is the legacy and the charge of that generation that gave so much and changed the world 3/4 of a century ago. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you. This morning, we are also joined remotely from historic World War II sites across Virginia. It is now my pleasure to introduce April Cheek-Messier, President of the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia, Dr. Clay Mountcastle, Director of the Virginia War Memorial in Richmond, Virginia, and Amanda Williams, Education Manager at the MacArthur Memorial here in Norfolk, Virginia.
April Cheek-Messier, President of the National D-Day Memorial, and I'm speaking to you from Bedford, Virginia, the home to our nation's monument to D-Day. One of the most important events of the last century, this national memorial is located here in the small community of Bedford for a stark and poignant reason. Bedford, Virginia experienced the highest known per capita losses of any American community on D-Day. Having grown up here, I know Bedford to be a hometown which understands how costly war is and how precious peace is for our generation and the ones to follow. That is why I'm honored to join Virginia's World War I and World War II Commemoration Commission and its partners in marking the 75th anniversary of the end of the war. The end of the war in 1945 marked an important transition in world history. Those who lived through the Second World War witnessed unprecedented loss of life, heartbreaking incidents of man's inhumanity to man, and unparalleled destruction. But the war also meant that much of the world had made a principled stand against aggression and tyranny, and their victory was a triumph. We are here today to celebrate the fact that 75 years ago, freedom prevailed. The end of the war did not create a perfect world, but it did create an immeasurably better one. We have all been fortunate to live in a time with the World War II generation, the amazing men and women who secured victory for us. It has been my privilege to become close friends with many veterans, but it's been a sad reality that in recent years, I've had to say goodbye to too many. One of those was Jerry Yellen, one of the nation's most recognized World War II veterans. Yellen shared his harrowing story of having flown the final combat mission of World War II, in which his wingman became the final American to die in battle during the war, after the two took off from Iwo Jima to attack airfields near Japan. Lieutenant Philip Schlomberg, 19, of Brooklyn, New York, was shot down during that last raid after having a premonition that he would not come out of the mission alive. Sadly, his premonition was true. Jerry Yellen, who even in his last days served with us here at the memorial and gave back so much, repeatedly said to us all, "Only by learning about our past can we secure the future." We are the last generation who will have the opportunity to speak with the greatest generation. And it is an honor to ensure that the lessons and legacy of those amazing men and women survive and are passed down. On D-Day, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower issued a challenge to his forces in his famous Order of the Day, telling them they were part of a great crusade. He tasked them with no less than the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe and security for ourselves in a free world. The cost was great. Behind me are planted in a commemorative display for VJ Day 4,415 poppies, one for each Allied serviceman killed on June 6, 1944. We honor those who gave their lives, but we must never forget that in giving their lives, they enabled the completion of one of the most important missions the world has ever known. It would take 11 more months until the guns would fall silent in Europe. 3 months later, peace would come to the Pacific Theater. But as Ike had predicted, the free men of the world had marched together to victory. The poppy, that enduring symbol of mourning and of peace, reminds us of what war meant and of what peace enabled. We invite each one of you to take time and ponder the meaning of today, of what we have and why, and then to renew our nation's commitment to the ideals of freedom. And to those surviving veterans whose victory we celebrate today, we say thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your leadership in creating a better world. And thanks to each of you for our freedom. Here at the National D-Day Memorial, we salute you all. Thank you.
Good morning. This is Clay Mountcastle, the director of the Virginia War Memorial. And on behalf of the Virginia War Memorial, I too would like to thank every World War II veteran that's watching this morning. I'd like to thank you not only for your service and defending freedom, but more importantly, I want to thank you for sharing your story with us throughout the generations. That story is so important for who we are as a country. It's the greatest story in human history. It covers every human emotion from joy to sadness to fear to even love. And that story we've had the pleasure of telling at the Virginia War Memorial since the memorial was first dedicated in 1956. And today, it is the heart and soul of what we do at the memorial, and that's teach and educate. Everyone that comes to the Virginia War Memorial will see the more than 9,000 names inscribed on the wall. 9,000 Virginians that went to World War II to defend freedom, defend their country, and never made it home to Virginia. They come from every part of the Commonwealth, every little town, every county, or as I like to say, from Winchester to Emporia, from Accomack to Big Stone Gap. World War II truly influenced not only our country, our lives, but the Commonwealth in a deeply personal way. So thank you for that. We, the generation that carries on and future generations, now own that story. We have to share it with our children. We have to share it with those that come to Virginia from other parts of the country and other parts of the world to hear it, because it is so precious to us. We have an inscription at the War Memorial from General Lucian Truscott that he presented during a Memorial Day speech in Italy in 1945. And he said, quote, "It is a challenge to us, all allied nations, that they shall not have died in vain." So we now take on that challenge to continue to honor them and to tell their story for now and for future generations. We thank you so much for what you did, for making 75 years ago today one of the greatest days in human history. And we promise that for the 9,000 Virginians that never made it home, we will continue to honor them. We will continue to tell their story. And we want to let you know that when you come to the Virginia War Memorial, we are very proud of every single one of you. Thank you for serving your country, and to everybody that wants to learn that story more, I encourage you to visit the Virginia War Memorial to see for yourself just how amazing the story of World War II is. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Greetings from the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. My name is Amanda Williams, and it's my honor to virtually welcome you to the memorial today. The memorial is a research center and a museum that is dedicated to preserving and presenting the story of General Douglas MacArthur and that of the millions of men and women who served with him. Thank you to Major General Williams for reading General MacArthur's speech, and thank you to Virginia's World War I and World War II Commission for the years that you have devoted to ensuring that Virginia honors the veterans of the World Wars. And thank you to our fellow World War II museums who join us in working tirelessly to present this history to even the youngest of our citizens. War tests nations and systems. And in the decade leading up to World War II, there was an argument that democracy was not viable, that democracy could not withstand the stress and strain of the complex modern challenges that people faced. That argument was false, and that argument was laid to rest on the deck of the Missouri 75 years ago today. But that doesn't mean that World War II was an easy victory. The human cost of that war was incomprehensible. In the European theater, even the most battle-hardened soldiers were sickened by the evil they saw as they liberated or came across concentration camps. In the Pacific, a witness to the war in the Philippines called it the best imagining of hell. The war was awful, and no one understood the ugliness of the war better than General MacArthur, himself a veteran of the First World War. So how could a world so torn apart ever heal? 75 years ago today, General MacArthur's speech aboard the Missouri set the tone. It was not a victory lap for the Allies. That had taken place weeks earlier as word broke of Japan's agreement to surrender. Instead, the ceremony aboard the USS Missouri was a sober start of a new challenge, of rebuilding, of liberty, of justice, and of an earnest quest for peace. On the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, we affirm that there was absolutely no substitute for victory in World War II. Thank you to our veterans, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We will meet again, but while we wait, be assured that Virginia's World War II museums will continue to preserve and present this history for generations to come. Thank you.
Amanda, April, and Clay, thank you. As we close this ceremony, and as we close Virginia's 4-year commemoration of the 75th anniversary of World War II, please welcome Delegate Kirk Cox, Chairman of the Virginia World War I and World War II Commemoration Commission.
Thank you so much, Greg. Good morning. As Chairman of the World War I and World War II Commission, it's a privilege to speak to you this morning from the surrender deck of the USS Wisconsin at Nauticus in Norfolk. 75 years ago today, the most destructive and far-reaching conflict in the world that we've ever seen came to a close in a setting just like this one, on the USS Wisconsin sister ship, the USS Missouri. That morning, hundreds of sailors crowded the decks of the USS Missouri to witness the historic moment that we commemorate today. The moment that representatives of Japan, representatives of the Allied powers, and General Douglas MacArthur met to sign the document that brought an official end to the war. With this anniversary of the end of the war comes, and I would say sadly, the end of Virginia's 4-year commemoration of the 75th anniversary of World War II and the 100th anniversary of World War I. The World War I and World War II Commission was created in 2016 by the General Assembly with two major goals. First, honor all veterans whose sacrifices we must never forget, and in paying tribute to their service, communicate to today's service members that they too will be remembered. And second, to help Virginians uncover and explore their own connections to both wars and keep this history alive. The Commission has carried out its work through a number of programs, including commemorative ceremonies like this one, teacher symposiums, the Profiles of Honor Tour, which was a mobile museum accompanied by a scanning project that traveled the state, collecting and preserving documents and images from World War I and World War II, which are now archived in the Library of Virginia for permanent public access. This morning you heard from the National D-Day Memorial, the Virginia War Memorial, and the MacArthur Memorial. It has been a privilege to work with these and so many other partners across Virginia who do the work daily, day in and day out, to keep history alive and connect to the present. Their work, which has been an integral to the Commission's work, began long before the commemoration, and the good news, it'll continue long after. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of World War II, we have been blessed to live in a world that we still share with so many of the heroes who fought in it. There will never again be a commemoration of World War II like this commemoration, where those who remember the war have shared their memories, their wisdom, and their very lives with us. 75 years ago, General Douglas MacArthur shared his hope that, I quote, "A better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." In 2020, the world has changed in ways that we could never have foreseen. Though many of you, our veterans, are with us in spirit and are even watching from home, boy, I wish we had the final opportunity during the 75th anniversary commemoration to honor you here in person. Please know that we are always grateful for you. But while we cannot shake your hand, thank you in person, we can still show our gratitude in a way that matters most by caring for the world that you created for us. As we remember your sacrifices and carry forward your stories, we take seriously our duty to protect this gift that you gave to us, a freer and safer world. As this ceremony and this commemoration comes to a close, we leave you with a final review of the 4-year commemoration with the words of Dr. E. Bruce Heilman, a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps who fought in the Battle of Okinawa, the last and largest battle of the Pacific Theater. Dr. Heilman began this commemoration with us 4 years ago. In 2016, we held a ceremony at the Virginia War Memorial to welcome him home from, believe this, a solo 6,000-mile cross-country motorcycle trip that he embarked upon when he was 90 years old. In recognition of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the 75th anniversary of America's entry into the war, Dr. Heilman is no longer with us for the commemoration's end, but he, along with so many other veterans who took part in it, left us with a deeper understanding and profound gratitude for all they've given to us. To all the men and women whose sacrifices then have ensured our freedom, today we say thank you. World War I, World War II commemoration was created by the General Assembly for the purpose of honoring veterans of these conflicts that shaped our world. I promise that we will take seriously our charge, and we pledge to carry your memory forward and tell your story. We will not forget your service and what their sacrifices bequeathed to us. We honor you, and we will remember you.
The most transforming experience in my life, and millions like me, was the military and what it demanded of us, what it provided for us, the pride it instilled in us, the opportunities it offered to us, and the camaraderie and the companionship it made possible for us. We experienced a pride-filling adventure fostered by love of our country and determination to remain free. The whole nation went to war and became the force that obliterated the dictatorial ambitions of those who would have put us in chains.
As a retired history and government teacher for 30 years, one of my passions is teaching others about the momentous events of our past that make America so special. However, as I've listened to the accomplishments of the men and women being listed during the Parade of Honor, I was struck by the notion that we are the students and you are the teachers.
This commemoration highlights the sacrifices of those 400,000 who gave their lives in the service of their country, and for those who were wounded in action, and for all those before me here today who were willing to die for their country. We came back to a grateful nation which provided a warm welcome and the GI Bill. We weren't promised a rose garden in the military or out, but were given opportunities to elevate our capabilities in a free society. Serving our country added to our self-worth. It was all about honor, courage, and commitment. We went where there was no path. We didn't go where the path led. I gave 4 years of my life to my country, and my country has given me the best of the rest of my life. In the recesses of our minds, we wonder what happened to those who were our buddies during that period, our partners in battle, our friends on liberty, our support in training, and the only family available to us at those crucial times. History cannot convey the intensity of those relationships which transcend the years. So many from the past have succumbed to age and infirmities that few would be able to stand long enough to speak for the 15,500,000 who are deceased, as well as the 500,000 remaining, and only a few of us will live beyond 95. But while the light of our future may not be as bright as in the past, we're not gone yet. We take strength in Tennyson's words as Ulysses' admonitions to his compatriots says to continue their journey irrespective of age. Old age has yet its honor and its toil. Some work of noble worth may yet be done. Come, my friends, it's not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the Gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much remains, and though we're not now that strength which in past years moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. We're all looking forward to attending the 75th anniversary of World War II in 2020 with Virginia leading the way. Not all of us will survive the journey, but already we're there in spirit, with the satisfaction of having served our country when it made a difference. We take pride in these special tributes. Thanks to Virginia for the celebration of victory and for the recognition of the victors.
The words of Dr. Heilman. He was a gem and will always be remembered. This concludes our ceremony and Virginia's commemoration of the 75th anniversary of World War II. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again and always to the men and women who made this commemoration possible through their sacrifices 75 years ago. Good day.